I remember the exact moment I stopped believing her. Not the moment I found proof. Not the moment I confronted her. Not even the moment I changed the locks and stacked her suitcases on the front porch in the November cold. The moment I stopped believing her was quieter than all of those. It was a Tuesday evening in September, and I was standing in our kitchen doorway watching Emily laugh at something on her phone, and the laugh was so unguarded, so completely unaware of me, that I understood, in the wordless way you understand things you aren't ready to say out loud, that whoever was on the other end of that screen had more of her than I did. I didn't say anything. I went back to the living room and turned the television up slightly and told myself I was tired. That was the first lie I told myself. It wasn't the last. My name is Jason. At the time this story begins, I was 36 years old, working as a senior account manager for a mid-sized consulting firm in the city, the kind of job that sounds more impressive than it feels from the inside, all client calls and quarterly reviews and the low-grade pressure of being responsible for other people's expectations. Emily and I had been together for nearly 12 years, married for almost 10. We had no children, which had been a mutual decision for years, and then, more recently, a subject we had quietly stopped discussing altogether. We had a house in a good neighborhood, 2 reliable cars, a shared savings account, and what I had believed, until fairly recently, was a marriage that had simply entered its quieter, more comfortable phase. I know how that sounds now. At the time, it felt like maturity. Emily worked in client relations for a hospitality group, a job that had always involved a certain amount of evening work, networking events, and what she called relationship maintenance with key accounts. This meant, in practice, that she had always had legitimate reasons to be out late, to dress well on weeknights, to take calls I wasn't supposed to overhear. Her job had, for years, provided the perfect structural cover for anything she might have wanted to hide. I understood that only in retrospect. She was 34. She was attractive in a way that had always made me quietly proud and occasionally insecure. The kind of woman who walked into a room and was noticed without trying, or perhaps while appearing not to try. She was socially fluent, professionally polished, and, as I would come to understand, extraordinarily skilled at managing multiple versions of the truth simultaneously. But in September, when I stood in that kitchen doorway and watched her laugh at her phone, I didn't know any of that yet. I just knew something felt wrong, in the way a house feels wrong before you can find the source of the draft. I went to bed that night and lay in the dark listening to her moving around the kitchen, the soft percussion of her routine, the tap running, the cabinet closing, the phone set face down on the counter, and I thought about the last time she'd laughed like that with me. Really laughed, the way you laugh when your guard is entirely down. Couldn't place it. Sometime in the spring, maybe, before the gym routine changed, before the work dinners became more frequent, before the perfume. She came to bed and said goodnight and turned away from me, and I lay there in the dark thinking about nothing and everything, and somewhere in the space between wakefulness and sleep I made a decision without knowing I'd made it. I was going to start paying attention. The first thing I noticed, once I began to notice, was the phone. Not that she had one. Not that she used it constantly, everyone did. What I noticed was the angle. The way she held it slightly away from vertical, screen tilted toward her at a degree that made it impossible to see from any adjacent position. It was subtle enough to be completely deniable, the kind of adjustment that could easily be unconscious. But once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. At the dinner table, on the sofa, in the passenger seat of the car, always that same small tilt, that small management of visibility. I began cataloging other things the way you catalog symptoms when you're afraid of a diagnosis. The new perfume, something darker and more complex than what she'd worn for years, applied on evenings when she was supposedly going to the gym. I knew what her gym bag smelled like. Sweat and the faint plastic of her water bottle. Not sandalwood and something floral I couldn't name. The gym itself. She'd switched from the gym 3 blocks from our house, the one she'd used for 4 years, the one where she knew the staff by name, to a new one downtown 40 minutes away because she said the equipment was better. She went on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and sometimes Saturday mornings, and she was always gone for at least 2.5 hours, which, for a 40-minute commute each way, left remarkably little time for actual exercise. The work dinners. They had always existed, but they had multiplied. Once a week became twice a week, then occasionally 3 times. The names of the clients she cited shifted. I noticed this because I'd made a habit, years ago, of remembering the name she mentioned so I could ask follow-up questions, one of those small relational efforts that seems minor but accumulates into something. The names were cycling differently now. New names appeared and then disappeared. Old reliable names she'd mentioned for years surfaced less often. And then there were the expenses. I handled our joint account, had always handled it by mutual arrangement, and in September I began noticing charges I couldn't account for. Not large ones. Nothing dramatic. But a restaurant charge on a Wednesday she'd told me she was working late at the office. A hotel spa charge on a Friday she'd said she was visiting her mother upstate. Small amounts, individually innocent, collectively forming a pattern I didn't want to complete. I called Mark about it. Mark was one of my closest friends. We'd known each other since university. The kind of friendship that survives years of separate lives because its foundation is solid enough not to require constant maintenance. He listened to me go through it, and then he said, very carefully, "What do you think is happening?" "I don't know," I said. "Yes, you do," he said. I didn't respond to that. We talked about other things. But the words sat with me for days. David, my other close friend, took a different approach when I brought it up with him a week later over beers. David was more pragmatic, less inclined toward the emotional temperature of a situation. He said, "Have you looked at the full bank history? Not just recent. All of it." I hadn't. I told myself I didn't want to, but the truth was I was afraid of what I'd find, and that fear, the specific fear of confirmed knowledge, is different from doubt. Doubt is uncomfortable. Knowledge is irreversible. At home, Emily was maintaining her surface. She asked about my work. She made dinner twice a week. She was warm in the ordinary ways of a long marriage, not passionate, not particularly present, but functionally affectionate. She said, "I love you," at night the way people say drive safe. Reflexively, out of established habit, without loading the words with meaning. And I said it back the same way. And we both pretended that was enough. One evening she came home from what she'd called a client dinner and I was already in bed, reading. She was in a good mood, elevated slightly, the way you are after a pleasant evening with people who engage you. She kissed me on the forehead and went to shower, and I lay there with my book open and unread, listening to the water run, and I thought about the charge I'd seen that morning. A restaurant I didn't recognize, the kind that appears in food publications rather than neighborhood guides. A Wednesday, $140, 2 people's worth of food. She never mentioned a dinner that Wednesday. She'd said she was finishing a report. I closed my book. I turned off my bedside lamp. And I lay in the dark for a long time, very still, while the shower ran and the house settled around me, and I understood that I was no longer going to be able to not know. The question was what I was going to do about it. It was David who first said Nathan's name, and he didn't even realize he had. We were having lunch, the 3 of us, in early October. Mark, David, and I at a corner table in a place near David's office. I'd been talking obliquely about the situation at home, careful still not to say the thing directly. And David, who worked in a world adjacent to Emily's industry, said, "Does she ever mention a guy called Nathan? He runs one of the hospitality accounts downtown. Big networker. Kind of person you see at every industry event." I said I didn't know. I said why. David shrugged. "Ran into Emily at a thing last month. They seemed pretty comfortable with each other. Just wondered if she'd mentioned him." "What kind of comfortable?" Mark asked before I could. David looked at his food. "Comfortable," he said again and left it there. I drove home from that lunch with Nathan's name running through my mind like a frequency I couldn't tune out. That evening, I looked him up. Took 10 minutes. He was easy to find, a professional profile, polished and vague in the way of people who want to be discoverable without being too specific. Mid-40s. Good-looking in an expensive way. The kind of man whose life seemed to have been arranged with deliberate aesthetic care. I looked at his profile for a long time and then I closed it and told myself I was building something out of nothing. But I began watching differently after that. I watched the way Emily held her phone when a message arrived. The small, involuntary stillness, like someone hearing a sound in the dark. I watched the way she excused herself to the bathroom mid-evening, not because she needed to, but because something had happened on her screen that required a private response. I watched the way she spoke about work, the new ease in her voice when she described evenings out, a comfort that hadn't been there before, the comfort of someone whose fabrications have become familiar enough to feel natural. And then she made a mistake. On a Thursday in mid-October, she told me she had a work dinner. A client from out of town, an important account, couldn't be rescheduled. She'd probably be home by 10. She kissed me on the cheek and left at 7, and I stood at the front window and watched her drive away, and then I did something I hadn't planned to do. I got in my car and followed her. Not closely. I kept 2 cars back, stayed in the right lane, used the GPS to anticipate her route rather than track it visually. She drove downtown, which was consistent with a work dinner. She parked in a garage on the 3rd block of a street I knew. A good area, good restaurants. I parked on the street 2 blocks back and walked. She went into a restaurant called Aldine. It was the kind of place with no signage visible from the street, just a discreet brass number above a dark door. I'd walked past it before without ever going in. It was not the kind of place you take a client you're merely maintaining. It was the kind of place you go when you want the evening to mean something. I stood on the opposite side of the street, in the partial shelter of a recessed doorway, and I waited. 15 minutes later, a man arrived. Tall, dark coat, the unhurried walk of someone who expects to be waited for. He paused at the door and glanced at his phone. Nathan. I recognized him from the profile photo, though he looked more assured in person, the way some people do when they move from image to reality. He went inside. I stood on the street in the October cold for a long time, looking at the closed door of that restaurant, and I felt something shift inside me that has no clean name. Not anger, not grief, not even betrayal exactly. Something structural. The feeling of a belief you've been living inside suddenly becoming a space you can see from outside. I walked back to my car. I sat in it for 20 minutes. Then I drove home and made myself a drink and sat at the kitchen table and waited for her. She came home at 10:15, composed, fragrant with the same restaurant air that clings to you when you've been somewhere nice. She said the dinner had gone well. She named a client. She asked if I'd eaten. I said yes. I said good night. I went to bed, and I began, quietly and methodically, to build a case. The bank records took me one evening. I sat at my desk with the full account history open on my laptop. Not just recent months, but the past 2 years, the way David had suggested, and I went through it transaction by transaction with a yellow legal pad beside me. I was methodical about it, the way I was methodical about client accounts at work, separating verifiable from ambiguous, cross-referencing dates against what Emily had told me she was doing. What emerged, over 3 hours, was not subtle. Hotel charges, 4 of them in the past 8 months at properties in the city and twice at a hotel near the airport, the kind of hotel you choose when you want proximity to transport and distance from your neighborhood. Each charge was mid-range, a single night, paid on her personal card which fed our joint account. Each corresponded to an evening she'd been working late or staying at her mother's. Restaurant charges, 11 that I could identify as inconsistent with any event she'd described to me. Several at Aldine. 2 at another address I looked up, a private dining club in the financial district, members only, the kind of place that doesn't advertise. And then there were the travel charges. 2 weekend trips, both in the past 6 months. One to a city 3 hours away. She'd told me it was a work conference. One to a coastal town she'd mentioned wanting to visit someday. Which apparently someday had come and gone without me. I sat with that legal pad for a long time after I finished. I thought about calling Mark or David. I didn't. This felt like something I needed to hold alone for a while before I let anyone else near it. I thought about Tom, my manager at work. A straightforward man who had, the previous week, called me into his office to ask if everything was all right at home because my focus had been off recently. I told him everything was fine. Now I thought about what fine had cost me, in attention, in presence, in the quiet erosion of a man who is trying to hold 2 realities in his mind at the same time. The following week, I set up a separate email account. I began screenshotting the bank records, Emily's public social media activity. She'd checked in twice, at locations that matched the hotel district on dates that matched 2 of the charges. Small things but precise. The kind of evidence that doesn't explain itself but fits together into a shape that can't be mistaken. I also hired a small, discreet service, not a private investigator, but a financial records consultant, a woman Mark recommended who worked with people in exactly this kind of situation. She confirmed, within a week, that Emily had a secondary credit card I hadn't known about, linked to an account opened 18 months ago. The charges on it were extensive. The pattern was clear. 18 months. That was the number that stayed with me. Not a moment of weakness. Not a situation that had gotten away from her. 18 months was a parallel life. Sustained, managed, actively maintained. I also, during this period, received a call from Tom that I didn't expect. He told me, with evident discomfort, that someone had made an informal complaint against me at work. Nothing formal, not filed through HR, but relayed through a mutual acquaintance in the organization. The complaint suggested that I had behaved inappropriately toward a female colleague at an off-site event 2 months prior. I had attended that event. I had spoken to several colleagues. Nothing had happened. Nothing close to anything had happened. I asked Tom who had raised the concern. He said he didn't know the origin, just that it had reached him indirectly. I thanked him and hung up and sat in my car in the office parking lot for 15 minutes. Emily. I didn't know how, not yet, but I knew it was connected. A preemptive move or a retaliatory one. Either she suspected I was close to knowing, or she was managing her own exposure by creating noise around mine. It was the kind of thing someone does when they have enough social intelligence to understand that offense is sometimes the best defense. It made me colder than anything I'd found in the bank records. I called Mason that afternoon. He was a lawyer, a referral from Mark, family law, serious and understated. I told him I needed to understand my options. He said, "Come in Thursday." I went home that evening and made dinner and set the table and ate across from Emily while she talked about a client presentation, and I nodded and asked questions and gave nothing away. I was ready. I chose a Saturday. Not for drama. I'm not a dramatic person, and I hadn't planned any of what followed as a performance. I chose Saturday because it was the day I knew Emily had no standing excuse to leave, no client dinner or gym session to retreat to. I chose it because by that point I had everything I needed, and the only thing left was the conversation itself, which I had been rehearsing, in pieces, for 3 weeks. She was in the kitchen when I came downstairs at 9. She was making coffee, wearing the gray sweater she'd had for years, her hair still loose from sleep. For a moment, standing in the kitchen doorway, the same doorway where this had all begun, in September, watching her laugh at her phone, I felt the full weight of almost 10 years. Not sentiment exactly, more like the grief of a landscape you know you're leaving. I sat down at the kitchen table. I placed the folder in front of me. She glanced at it. Something crossed her face. Not guilt, but a rapid calculation, the kind I'd learned to recognize. "We need to talk," I said. "Okay," she said carefully, pouring her coffee. "Sit down, Emily." She sat. She looked at the folder. She looked at me. I opened it. I didn't narrate or explain. I simply placed the documents in front of her, one at a time. The bank statements with the hotel charges highlighted. The screenshots of her check-ins. The records from the secondary card. The restaurant charges. The travel history. She was very still. "Nathan," I said. "And whoever else." "Jason." "How long?" She looked at the table. "It's complicated." "How long, Emily?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nathan, about 8 months. Officially." "Officially," I repeated. She looked up. Something in her face had shifted into a register I hadn't seen from her before. Not remorse, not exactly, but a kind of stripped-down honesty that only surfaces when all the exits are closed. There were others. Before Nathan. It wasn't serious, it was others, I said. She said nothing. "The hotel near the airport," I said. "Twice. The coastal weekend. The conference that wasn't a conference. I didn't plan for it to." "I know you didn't plan it," I said. "That's not the question. The question is how long you were willing to let me live inside a lie." She looked at me then, fully, and I saw something I hadn't expected. She looked tired. Not guilty, not frightened. Tired. The way you look when a weight you've been carrying for a long time has finally been set down by someone else. I didn't know how to tell you, she said. You didn't tell me, I said. I found out. I know. Nathan, I said. Is he who you want? She hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer would have. He ended it, she said finally quietly. 2 weeks ago. I looked at her for a moment. So, you've been sitting across from me at this table for 2 weeks knowing all of it was over and still saying nothing. She didn't answer. I closed the folder. I stood up. I want you to know, I said, that I also know about the complaint at my workplace. I don't know exactly what you said or how you said it, but I know it came from you. And I want you to know that I've documented that too. Her expression shifted, quickly, involuntarily, and then settled back into composure. But I'd seen it. I've spoken to a lawyer, I said. The finances are being separated today. I've already spoken to the bank. The locks are being changed this afternoon. I'd arranged both things earlier in the week, timed for this morning. Your bags are in the guest room. I packed them last night. She stared at me. You're not serious. I'm very serious. Jason, we've been together for 10 years. I know how long we've been together. You can't just, we need to talk about this properly, we are talking, I said. This is the conversation. She tried 4 more approaches in the next 20 minutes. She said she loved me. She said the affairs were symptoms, not causes. That something had broken between us years ago and she hadn't known how to fix it. She said she'd go to therapy, that she'd do whatever it took. She said I was being cold and reactive and that this wasn't who I was. That last one almost reached me. Not because it was true, but because it was almost true. I had never been this cold, this organized, this finished. But the version of me who would have softened, who would have sat back down and reopened the conversation, had been somewhere in the process of these past weeks quietly replaced by someone who understood, very clearly, that softening now would only delay an ending that was no longer avoidable. I need you to leave, I said. She left at noon. She took her bags and her car and she left, and I stood at the window and watched her go. And then I went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet house for a long time. Then I opened my laptop and sent the email. I had written it carefully over 2 evenings. Factual, unemotional, comprehensive. It went to Mark and David, to our mutual friends, to 3 of her colleagues who had, I had reason to believe, been complicit in covering for her, and to her mother, whom I had always liked and who deserved, I thought, to know the truth before Emily had the chance to construct her version of it. The email contained the key facts, the documented evidence, and a clear statement that the marriage was over and that I would have no further contact through informal channels. I did not send it out of anger. I sent it because Emily was someone who managed narratives, and I was not willing to be the protagonist in hers. The weeks after she left were strange in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had expected grief. I had expected the specific emptiness of a house that used to contain 2 people and now contains 1, the way sound behaves differently, the way the refrigerator seems larger, the way Tuesday evenings have a texture they didn't used to have. And all of that was there. But underneath it, and more persistent than I'd expected, was something else. Relief. Not the small relief of attention released. Something deeper. The relief of a man who has been carrying a weight he didn't fully know he was carrying until the moment it was gone. The weight of doubt. The weight of translating everything. The weight of lying in the dark and running calculations I didn't want to run. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending on the management of uncertainty until the uncertainty was over, and I had that energy back, and I didn't entirely know what to do with it at first. Mason was efficient and thorough. The financial separation was completed within 3 weeks. Emily had, through her secondary account, accumulated a pattern of personal expenditure that complicated her position in the asset division, not devastatingly but meaningfully. The false workplace complaint was documented and formally withdrawn when Mason communicated our awareness of its origin. Tom called me personally to say the matter was closed and that he was sorry I'd had to deal with it. I told him I appreciated it and meant it. Emily reached out multiple times in the first month. Text messages at first, then calls, then a letter, handwritten, which I found myself respecting slightly even as I chose not to respond to it. She asked to meet. She asked me to reconsider. She said the email had been cruel. She said she understood why I'd sent it, but asked me to consider the damage it had done to her professionally and personally. I thought about that for a long time, whether the email had been the right thing to do. I had been deliberate and factual rather than vindictive, but I was honest enough with myself to acknowledge that it had also been a form of retaliation. Controlled, documented, but retaliation nonetheless. I didn't regret it exactly, but I held it carefully as a choice I'd made and owned. Mark and David were present in the way that matters, not constantly but reliably. Mark came over one evening about 3 weeks in, bringing food and no agenda, and we sat in the living room for 3 hours talking about everything and nothing and eventually about the specific sadness of ending something that had once been real. Because it had been real. Whatever Emily had become or had always been, there had been a period, years, not months, when what existed between us was genuine. I grieved that. I let myself. David, characteristically, was more direct. He said, "You need to do something with the house. Change something. Paint a room. Move furniture. Give yourself permission to stop living inside a monument to before." I painted the bedroom. A different color. Something I'd have chosen years ago if I'd been the one to choose. Took a weekend and it felt, unexpectedly, like an act of self-reclamation. In December, through Mark, I met Anna. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the story of what happened with Emily is not primarily a story about what came next. But Anna is a presence worth acknowledging. She was a friend of Mark's sister, recently relocated to the city, working in architecture. She was quiet in a way that wasn't absence but attention, the quality of someone who listens before they speak. We had coffee twice before December ended. Nothing dramatic, just two people in a city in winter, talking carefully and honestly, which felt, after everything, like an almost unbearable luxury. The divorce was finalized in February. I signed the papers in Mason's office on a gray Tuesday morning, and afterward I walked to a coffee place I liked 2 blocks away and sat at a window table and watched the city move past for an hour. I thought about the September evening when I'd stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Emily laugh at her phone. 9 months ago, almost exactly. The distance between that evening and this one felt simultaneously enormous and strangely compressed. The way significant time always feels in retrospect, too large to hold and too real to simplify. I thought about what I'd learned. Not the lessons you tell people. Not the packaged wisdom of someone who has been through something hard and come out with aphorisms. The actual, practical, unglamorous things. That avoidance is expensive. That the cost of not asking a question is never zero. It's the question plus interest, compounding daily. That I had spent a year paying that cost without acknowledging I was paying it, and that the debt had ultimately been collected all at once. That trust is not the same as faith. Faith is belief without evidence. Trust is belief supported by evidence, updated honestly as evidence changes. I had stopped updating honestly somewhere in the middle years of our marriage, and what I'd called trust had quietly become faith, the willful suspension of what I was actually seeing. That the version of Emily I had loved was real, and the version of Emily I had discovered was also real, and that both things being true was one of the harder facts of a situation like this to hold. And that cold clarity, the kind I'd operated from in those final weeks, packing her bags, speaking to Mason, sending the email, is not the same as strength. It's what strength looks like when grief hasn't fully arrived yet. The grief comes later, slower, less dramatically than you expect. And it comes regardless of who was right. I walked out of the coffee shop and back into the February city, collar up against the cold, and I thought about Anna and whether I'd call her that evening. And I thought about the bedroom I'd painted and the furniture I'd rearranged and the house that was mine now, genuinely mine, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Forward. Just that. The simple, unglamorous, essential sensation of moving forward. What makes Jason's story worth examining isn't the scale of Emily's deception, though the scale is significant. It's the fact that the deception was made possible, sustained, and extended by Jason's own willingness not to see. Think about that September evening, the kitchen doorway, Emily laughing at her phone. Jason registered something real in that moment. He felt the emotional truth of it. That laugh was aimed elsewhere. And then he walked back into the living room and turned up the television. That choice, not a failure of intelligence but a failure of willingness, set the stage for everything that followed. At what point would you have stopped walking away? The pattern that emerges over the following weeks is one of accumulating evidence met with accumulating rationalization. The gym that made no logistical sense. The perfume that didn't match the destination. The restaurant charge on a night she'd said she was at the office. Each one was explainable individually. Together, they were not. But Jason needed them to be explainable, because the alternative required him to dismantle something he'd spent 10 years building. This is what psychologists would call motivated reasoning, not stupidity, but the mind's powerful instinct to protect a belief system from the cost of updating it. Emily's behavior follows a pattern that is more common than it is dramatic. Not a single catastrophic decision, but an 18-month architecture of parallel living, maintained through small consistent lies and the exploitation of structural cover that her job had always provided. What's notable is the workplace complaint, the preemptive strike against Jason's professional reputation. That move reveals something beyond infidelity, a willingness to cause active harm to protect her position. That's not the behavior of someone who got lost in a feeling. That's calculated. The turning point, the restaurant, Nathan arriving, Jason watching from across the street in the October cold, matters not because it provided proof, but because it ended Jason's ability to maintain uncertainty. You can rationalize a credit card charge. You cannot rationalize what you have physically witnessed. The body knows, and once the body knows, the mind's work changes from avoiding the truth to processing it. What Jason did next, the methodical documentation, the financial separation, the legal preparation, all completed before he said a single word to Emily, speaks to a man who understood instinctively that his leverage was in knowing before she knew he knew. That instinct was correct. Emily's primary skill was narrative management. Jason took that skill away from her by removing any opportunity to shape the story first. The lesson here is precise. The longer you delay honest confrontation with something you already sense is true, the more power you surrender. Jason delayed for months, and the cost was not just months of pain, it was the secondary credit card, the travel records, the workplace complaint. The earlier he'd asked the question, the less there would have been to find. There is a broader truth running through this story that goes beyond Jason and Emily specifically. Something about the gap between the relationship we're in and the relationship we believe we're in. For the last year of their marriage, Jason and Emily were not, in any meaningful sense, in the same relationship. Emily had built a separate life. Jason was maintaining a shared one. They ate at the same table, slept in the same bed, and said, "I love you" out of habit. And in that space between habit and honesty, the marriage had already ended. It just hadn't been named yet. This is what the accumulation of small, unexamined moments does. The angled phone, the unexplained charge, the new perfume, none of them demand a confrontation. All of them, together, represent a reality that is asking to be seen. When we choose not to see it, for comfort, for fear, for the protection of an investment, we aren't preserving the relationship. We're just postponing its ending while paying for it daily. Jason's growth isn't in his cold efficiency at the end, though that served him. It's in his willingness, finally, to stop translating. To let the evidence be what it was, not what he needed it to be. That willingness, to see clearly even when clarity is expensive, is the one thing no one can take from him going forward. And perhaps that is the most honest kind of ending. Not triumphant, not destroyed, but genuinely, quietly free.